welcome to Quantified Software. This is Miles Lassiter. Yeah, great to have you. And today our guest is Kiril Savino, who has experience as a founder, an engineer, and much more. I met Kiril when he became the first engineer at a startup that I started out of college. So I've known Kiril for a long time and seen his success in many roles, invested in one of his companies, and very excited to have him on today. Kiril, maybe we could start with sharing a little bit more about your background and perspective on software development and product management.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Kiril Savino. I've been doing this software thing in one form or another for, 20 plus years. Makes me feel very old, but also experienced and knowledgeable. I got into software engineering kind of by accident. I was, to that story, I was planning to take a gap year before doing a PhD in cognitive linguistics or something esoteric like that, and found startups and fell in love. And I had been like a self-taught programmer, and it was a hobby that turned into a passion, and more than anything else, building things, like building startups, but building anything is what gets me excited. It's what kept me out of grad school, and maybe never really looked back. But since then, I had a great career in engineering proper, building things at various different scales, from tiny startups where I was the only engineer to bigger companies. I was a lead engineer after that on a team of 16, mostly international. Started my own company, ran engineering teams as large as, 30-ish probably. And then went on to be a CTO a few times, like startup CTO. So again, that small, 15 to 30 engineers type organizations. And then from there, moved into product management, also known as the dark side of software development. It took me about 24 hours to start yelling at engineers, like, why can't you do it faster? And then I've been a CEO of a startup. My last few years, actually been working more on the marketing side of the world than the product side even, but I see them as sort of flip sides of each other. It's the same activity from two different perspectives. I can talk about all of that, but I still write code. I still have Emacs open on my computer right now, but the majority of the work I do these days is writing, human language, and talking a lot.
Well, welcome. Cam, take it away.
Yeah, welcome. That's a great intro. I'm super happy to have you on, and your diverse experiences with building software, I think, are going to be great. So one of the fundamental questions that comes up a lot in software is, how do you know what to build? So you have a list of 20 things you want. How do you know the priority? Which one do you start working on first? How do you do the priority judgment?
Yeah. So you're just going to ask the hardest question first? That's how this is going to go? Let me try to answer that a couple of ways, right? I think as an engineer, usually you're on the receiving end of the priorities. Here they are, in order, go. And you don't often get a lot of say over at least the priorities of the big things coming down the pipe at you. Good companies let you have conversations and be involved in that process, but you're still kind of a consumer of that system. And so I think from that lens, you're mostly saying, okay, well, what's the first thing to deliver for the business and whatever that means, while also prioritizing things that aren't necessarily for the business. I'm going to skip ahead in the question list and talk, technical debt and infrastructure, and there are all kinds of responsibilities beyond just delivering the next feature that fall on an engineering team. And I think that it's, at least my take is that it's engineering proper's responsibility to manage that balance in particular. From the outside, I think it's easy to sort of say, well, I want the engineers to do X because that's important to me. But I've always felt that engineering, there's nobody who can tell engineering exactly what has to be done next unless they're inside of the engineering system. Delivering the feature that's the highest priority can be a horribly irresponsible thing to do if, in fact, there's something that's going to cause the whole system to break down next month, right? So that's a funny trade-off, and that's the thing I've said. I've been on both sides of that one, and it was crazy how fast I shifted from from like everything's hard to like why can't I have it faster than that. And I think, but anyway, from the outside, I at least have always tried to draw a line when I'm on the product side of that to say that I don't think I should be reaching in any deeper than that. I'll tell you what I think the most high priority thing is from my point of view that I want delivered for the end user and why that matters. I think it's product's job to figure out how to make those prioritization decisions, and then to be able to actually explain them, justify them, get people excited about them, right? But not to get into the details of exactly how things get released, or even necessarily the timing of how things get released, which is maybe controversial. And prioritization from that point of view, wow, is a question that's so big I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about that in advance of this discussion. But you're really looking for, ideally, the further up you go in like in the abstraction layer, and like as a CEO, on my whiteboard above my desk, I would always keep like, what is the largest existential problem facing the business right now? Like, what's going to kill us next, right? And so the way I would prioritize is, all right, well, if that's what's going to kill us next, I'm going to fix that first. And then figure out, like, we need to unpack that. What does that actually mean? What do we have to do to solve that problem? What do we have to learn? And a lot of times, by the way, learning is almost always priority one in the startup. But like, it's like, how do you break that down into what's the next concrete step on that particular journey? And then as soon as you figure out you got one thing solved, no resting, erase it and put the next problem that's going to destroy the business up on the whiteboard, right? My rule used to be, when I could make obnoxious, arbitrary rules, that anything beyond the top 5 things to do was delusional and shouldn't even be written down, except maybe in someone's private notebook. But spend a lot of time figuring out what those 5 things should be.
So that's a view of software development where you should have almost no inventory of future work. Have you seen that work at an organizational scale where you only let the organization kind of keep an inventory of the 5 next things? You're shaking your head, so I'm guessing that's a no. That's a no.
That's like a very idealistic stance. But it comes from a couple places. One, absolutely not. In reality, organizational scale, you need all these extra backlogs, and especially product managers keep long lists of the stuff they think they might want to do someday, and they're plotting toward like, how do we set up this, the feature we're going to do 6 months from now with the work we're going to do today. But I ended up drawing a line between what sits on the backlog somewhere and is part of the planning process, and what gets put in front of the team as what we're trying to do next. And for 2 reasons, I think that the list needs to stay very, very short and concise. One is that long lists are depressing. Like, when you get, like, if you have a list of 5 items, like, okay, I can, at least in my experience, you say, okay, the number 1 item we're going to do. The number 2 item, 80% chance we're going to do, right? Because as I said earlier, like, I'm a big proponent of learning systems, which is why we'll skip another question, agile. I'm a very, very agile. I hate the word, but love the ideas kind of person, right? And that if you're doing the job the right way, you're constantly getting new information, right? Each iteration, which can be whatever it is, a day, a week, a month, whatever, you're getting something to the market, and you're getting market feedback. And market feedback, if you're paying attention to it, should also change something. Otherwise, why were you getting the feedback, right? So I'm like, okay, number 1 item, we're going to do that one for sure. And the number 2 item, we're probably going to do that one too, but like, we might actually learn something for number 1 where we've changed priorities anyway. Number 3, we're in the, like I say, usually 50-50 chance that one's going to happen. Like, it's probably going to be done, but like, it might not be done. And then in my mind, already 4 and 5 are already kind of in the land of delusion, because if it's more than like 1 or 2 release cycles out, what you learn in that time frame, both on the team and in the broader context, tends to change things, right? And so not only does it get, like, the further down the list you go, the more delusional it gets, but I also realized that if you think about, like, there's a master list of like a queue of items that's going to go into the process, you'd think that you're working from the top and you're adding to the bottom. The reality is you're working from the top and you're adding to the top, the middle, and the bottom at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. Because the big insights you have, like, ooh, that's one's important. We're putting that all the way at the top. So all of a sudden, like, you go to number 3 on the list.
Yeah.
Right. So I started to say, like, that 5 for me became like the number of things I can realistically say with confidence are going to be like, we're probably going to do.
So you mentioned this release cycle. You said maybe a day, a week, or you had a broad range of times. Have you seen in organizations sort of common patterns around what is a good cycle for that, or is it really dependent on the organization? How do you see feedback and frequency on release cycles?
Great question. I'm really pro, right? So I've played like almost every role in an organization at various points, and one of the more informative ones was actually I played COO for a few years and really spent a lot of time looking at like the process, the org structure, like the cadence, and a lot of that can be very boring. But the point is, I think that my angle is like designing organizations and systems for maximum continuous feedback, right? Like, how close can you get the people doing the work to the customers who are encountering the work? How quickly can you get that feedback to happen? And in a more mature organization, you have, let's say we have researchers and UX designers doing tests, and maybe you're doing tests 2-3 times a week, sometimes on prototypes and totally wacky concepts, sometimes on up and coming products, sometimes an existing product. So I believe in feedback loops as tight as possible, which I don't think there's a lower bound on that. Like how much, I guess you could check the results so often you didn't do anything, but otherwise, like one of my mantras is direction over velocity. So like if you're going really fast and you're not going in the right direction, like it's kind of like the worst thing you can do.
How do you measure that direction? I like that mantra, direction over velocity. It's better, I think, if I unpack that correctly, it's, am I doing the right thing over, am I doing a lot of stuff? Mm-hmm. So how do I measure that I'm doing the right thing? Or how have you seen that done well? Maybe how do you see it done poorly so that there's some elimination of the solution space?
Well, I think poorly usually comes down to not having the sort of organizational or systemic empathy for the customer or understanding of the business goals. You kind of need both, and hopefully they're well aligned, but they're kind of different concerns. And then ultimately, I mean, I'm kind of an idealist, right? So I want to do things that make people happy, and I want customers to clap, and I want great NPS scores and great reviews. But all those things, like if you're building a business, have to like come back to dollars and cents somewhere and pay the bills. So there's a lot of work in figuring out like how do you actually intersect the economics of a business with the value to the customer, and at least in what I think is a high functioning version of that process, right? And if you're doing well if, like, at the end of the day, the numbers are going in the right direction, and so is the consumer sentiment. And I think that's, like, I'm prone to lots of tangents, but if I can go on a quick digression here, I would say that, no, never mind, I lost it. So I'll come back to that tangent if I remember it again later. I know it's in my somewhere.
You mentioned a couple of great measures of NPS and also measuring reviews for a way to measure your customer sentiment. For internal, that's a good way to measure that you're kind of headed in the right direction, as you say. But for internal, what were the measures you've seen that have worked for your teams? Of how do you know if the team is functioning or clicking? Maybe you work on it and you feel good, but does that give you some indication that they're headed in the right direction, doing the right thing, working well?
Okay. That reminds me of what the digression was going to be, which is that I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what do you measure a team on? What do you measure individual on? Maybe a little bit harder, but there's a funny divide, I think, in this that I haven't figured out how to cross it perfectly well. It's that the business leaders, like whoever is your sort of the seat of strategy in the market, has to make these very large decisions about what we're going to try to do. And to some degree, how, at a very high level, how. We're going to go and build this feature because we think it'll make this kind of person happy, and that'll get us more subscriptions or something, right? And at least in my experience, you can't put those sort of external results numbers on the head of a team. At least in anything past, like, okay, we've got exactly one team maybe, because typically, I mean, and even if you do have exactly one team, you've got externalities that impact those results, right? Like, I ran a sports business, right? Talk about seasonal, and like if it rained, or this year, that business this year, have they had a hard year, right? Like there's no sports being played outside right now, and that's not the engineering team's fault, right? And the worst thing I think you can ever do to a team is to give them a number or a goal that they don't have control over and ask them to hit it. So there's this hard thing there where it's like, okay, I think about it as like you have to judge leadership and whoever, like, so it's typically I think product management or marketing, depending on the kind of organization that's really designing like the plan to attack the market and solve the big problem. You have to kind of judge the outcome based on that, and then on like the realities that happen in the market. And so when you're getting on the team level, I think about it as, okay, and by the way, I'm a cross-functional team kind of person, so like a pod with like it's engineers and product and design and marketing and QA and whatever all sitting in the same place, and analysts and doing the work together. So, but that team for me has always been the unit of activity or of progress, right, that drives these things forward. And on them, it's like they need to have a goal that they can control. And so usually that means, given the plan that we came up with and the idea that we had, did we do the thing we said we wanted to do in the way that we said we were going to do it, right? And that usually means on a smaller level than like the business results. It's, okay, we wanted to build this feature that makes people happy because it does X. New button on the screen. Okay, did we do that? Were they happy? Right? Like, did it work? You know, and you can track those things.
Did people click it, and did they like what happened when they clicked it? Kind of that more simplistic checklist of, is it out in the wild? Is it working? Is it doing the thing?
Do they understand it? Do they use it? Does it work? Right? And then does that lead to like an uptick in subscriptions? That question usually is much more complicated. And like I always say that like you should be, I would tell my teams, measure that and look at it constantly, but I'm not holding you accountable for that number.
I think you're saying also that you're not too focused on productivity. So the velocity of like how many features are being per unit, you're not really focused much on that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But you are saying eventually the team needs to deliver something.
Yeah.
So how do you think about like that question? Are they delivering? I mean, how?
Yeah.
Sort of yes or no, and kind of arbitrary timelines, or like negotiated timelines.
I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with timelines and deadlines. Yeah, mostly a hate relationship with them. But I've always, in hindsight, I tell this story. I think I wonder how I was mature enough to say this the way that I said it at the time. But years ago, I had a 6-month stint where I was director of engineering for like a growing company. They were in the middle of a pivot, trying to launch this whole new product, and my job was to, well, it was I had to kind of help like rebuild the team and add a bunch of capabilities, and then also deliver this product. And we had this crazy deadline. I was hired probably in September. We're supposed to ship the version 1 in February. And to make it even better, the company had just raised $10 million from big fancy VC X. And they called me into the December board meeting to talk about engineering. And I went in and people started asking questions, you know, how do we feel about the deadline? How do we feel about progress? And I don't know, whatever I ate that day was special or something. But I went to the whiteboard and I was like, all right, here's what I can control. But there's like 3 things. 1, I know how to hire good people. I'm going to get talented people sitting in the desks over there, the best ones I can find. 2, I know how to run a good process. Like, we're not going to be wasting time. We're going to be doing like work the right way. Everyone's going to be engaged and efficient. I said 3, I'm going to be super transparent about what we're working on. basically like whatever, like you're going to know that I have the best people I can get working as efficiently as I can on the most important thing that we've all agreed has to get done. It's like after that, we can hit the date with something, or we can deliver what we want whenever we're done. Like sort of like the laws of physics start to apply at a certain point. Like I can't magically snap my fingers and have the results come out however we want them to happen, right? And I think like the healthy way to have that conversation with engineers is to say, here's what we need to accomplish. When and how can we do that? I think above all, engineering's responsibility is to deliver something of quality and to deliver it the right way. And so it's not on me to say like, yeah, get X done by date Y. It has never worked in my experience once, right? And I am probably to an excessive degree, I refuse to do that, like as a consumer of work or as a delegator of work. There's some people who would probably tell you that they'd like to throttle me for that reason. Yeah, so I think that it's like
sorry to interrupt, but is that because it's so hard to estimate ahead of time?
Yeah. I feel like there's this ideal out there that if we were really, 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 really good at our jobs, we could estimate everything perfectly and give really reliable dates. In practice, that is, to the extent that that's even achievable at all, is achievable at a small scale for small projects. But most of the time, there's so many unknowns going on at any given moment, and unknowns in terms of like, okay, important person A quits a weekend. What am I going to do about that, right? Even though we thought really hard about the architecture, the feature we're going to build, and the technology we're going to use to implement it, we got there and realized, oops, we forgot about this part over here, and that turns out to be shockingly hard. Like I once wrote a blog post for engineers, and I called it the fun part, the hard part, and like the rest, right? And that wasn't the title. I can't remember the exact title. But the idea was that like when you're looking at estimating and looking at any project you're about to do, usually you can see two things. You can see the fun part, right? Like, ooh, I get to go use this cool new technology over there, and that'll be fun. And you can see the hard part. Like, well, the hardest thing in there is really this thing over here. I have to go learn a new algorithm or like do some machine learning, whatever. So that's going to be hard. That'll take a little while. Oh, and the last part of which was the details. In my experience, the details are like 80% of the work. And they tend to be somewhat invisible up front. It's really hard to see them. And like the more experienced you are, the better you get at spotting some of the details. But I don't know anybody who's figured out a better way to deliver an accurate date than to just pad it by a lot. Like, here's what we think it'll take. Now add, I think the judgment of the maturity of engineering team is how big their padding factor is, right?
Well,
like,
where's that maturity curve? What is the padding factor?
I think like an immature team is should probably padding by like 50%. Like add half as much time as you think you need to the project, and you'll have a realistic end goal for it. And then the more mature you get and the better you get at estimating, like it comes down to like 15, 20%. But you still need that. You need that buffer because there's so much that you don't know until you get in. And like that, I was going to tell you, like I take some issue with like how software engineering can actually be scientific, because we're working in this domain where, I mean, you can be scientific in that science is learning, right? But in the other way, predicting this stuff in advance.
Yeah, let's give the counter argument of why software either, and I'm not sure if you're saying this, but either can't be measured or shouldn't be measured. And so maybe we should distinguish, are you saying can't, like there's some physical impossibility, or that shouldn't in the complaint similar to Taylor management theory around it drives pathologic behaviors in ways that shouldn't be encouraged. So
that's a great frame. So I think I wouldn't say that you can't measure anything. You can measure a lot of things. But yeah, like what you measure will have meaningful consequences. And I think I've heard someone refer to this as sort of like quantitative theater, which is how a lot of organizations are actually run, which is like I'm going to show you a whole bunch of fancy numbers that justify everything that I'm doing and plans that go out years in advance and show wonderful growth curves on them. And it's like, well, I'm glad you made the numbers look really good. How much confidence is there in any of that, right? And one of my good friends who's like a mathematician and data scientist has always said that most of the time in a business is trying to get more and more precision on those numbers. Like there's definitely some lower bound on that, right? And it's probably the same as that maturity of individual team, maturity of individual business in a market, right? Like the more mature you get, the more precise you can get with your projections and your predictions and therefore your goals. But especially the smaller companies, like you're basically just making stuff up. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be measuring, like at all. I think you have to constantly be measuring. Like I'm more of a fan of quantitative sort of KPIs that we're going to look at and have a dashboard of and care about and learn from than having quantitative goals where we're going to try to hit a specific like conversion rate increase in something.
So what is that KPI dashboard that you're a fan of? Like when you've seen it work well, when you feel like that it's really driving the types of behaviors and the changes in the learning you talk about, what does that dashboard look like? What are the numbers you want everybody keyed in on?
Well, I think it's, first of all, ideally it's both qualitative and quantitative, right? So it's been a while since I've designed a dashboard like that. But I think first of all, every team needs to figure out what are the numbers that describe their universe, right? Like, okay, the team that's working on, I'm going to keep using like checkout or something as a simple example of like of a thing we can all reason about, right? And okay, you should understand the conversion rates between stages in your checkout process. You should understand cart abandonment rates. You should understand whatever, anything that you can measure in there that's within reason. You should be looking at those numbers and saying, do they matter? What do we know about them, right? Definitely thinking about them in terms of also like what's our confidence interval, any of those numbers, right? When I was really deep on working on like how do you measure things, I remember talking to a friend who at the time was working like running a product for Facebook. And I was talking to him about how do you guys measure stuff and how do you do this? And he was like, well, we have, my product, which is kind of small, has 100 million daily active users. So, right? I'm like, right, okay, we just started, like, we have completely different worlds, right? Like I don't even have 100 million users, period, full stop, ever, right? Like I've got 10,000 or 100,000 daily active users, like I can't, and the reality is at that level, you can't actually make any statistically relevant predictions at all, right? Like just by the math, it doesn't work, right? And most of us live in worlds where that is true, where like if we try to be precise and try to make like the p-values are nonsense, right? We may as well not do it. But you seem to be looking at it and saying like, well, it's bad if that goes up by or goes down by a lot, or it's really good if it goes up by a lot. Like, yeah, that matters. And if we launch a new feature and immediately after all of our numbers go in the wrong direction, we should be figuring out why, right? But the why is probably more important than the number even.
Are you saying split tests are junk?
In my experience, split tests are junk. Yeah, I'll say that with some confidence. Well, and we had an experiment at Game Changer once where we put a team, after a lot of pressure against all of my better instincts, we put a team on straight up optimization. And they did everything through a split test and like had numbers for every single thing they did. And it lasted about 3 months. At the end of 3 months, every single proven experiment that worked went into production, and there was not any meaningful impact on like spreadsheet level business numbers from the whole project, and we scrapped it. I felt really good about it because it sort of justified my existing biases. And split tests, of course, do work in simplistic situations, right? When you have large amounts of data and very clear, simple, like A versus B kind of stuff, you can do it. Like advertising is a great place for split tests. You can say, I'm going to say the same thing about the same product with like 2 different colors or 2 different images. And if you have enough traffic, you can get a statistically valid result that tells you that image A does better, right? Anything more complicated than that, and usually you're testing like one variable in like a 400 variable system. And so like no matter how well you optimize for that one variable, the system's going to do what it does, right? And like simple example of that, like at least how I comprehend it is that like we were like trying to fix like a checkout abandonment problem. And you think that by making everything easier, you'll improve the number. What you don't know, though, is what percentage of checkout abandonment is baked into user behavior, period, right? What percentage of people were there for the wrong reason? What you might need to actually optimize for is to go and get fewer people to go into the checkout process, right? Which, by the way, like you change the inputs to a system, you will change the outputs, right? So like, and everything in between. You change who you're targeting at the top of the funnel with a process, and like every number below that will start to change because you have different people in those moments, right? So I think like things like that make it very hard to drive like micro decisions that way, unless you're at like Facebook scale. And I'm thinking about, and then, so at the same time, like most of these things, this is why I think qualitative testing is just as important, and you need to have both, right? Because you look at a process and you can say, like, let's go, you can take something, okay, we think there's an opportunity here, this number looks bad, we should go and optimize that. Well, what the first thing you would do is then go and get some actual human beings into a room and walk them through it in a controlled environment and see how they behave and understand what's really, like, to the best we can, like, what's happening on the human level in that process, right? Then hopefully you find insights in there like, oh, it's not, the conversion rate here is irrelevant because the actual problem is somewhere else, right? Or you can see like, oh, the real problem is, and this is how I, by the way, this is how I intersected marketing and product in my head, is that like when I studied product, I was really into sort of behavioral psychology and human decision making, right? Like, why do people do things? If we're trying to make a product work a certain way, it's because we want them to do something that gets us money, right? And in there, you've got. I always go back to like the BJ Fogg model of there's motivation, trigger, and perceived difficulty of taking an action, right? And so you can work on any of those three things. You can work on the motivation level of a person to take the action you want them to take. You can work on the trigger level and make sure that they're poked at the right moment to take that action or prompted for it. Or you can work on the actual or perceived difficulty of accomplishing that action, right? But one of the biggest arguments we would always have in product was over like, to solve a given problem, are we supposed to be going in and making the product better so that we can reduce the actual friction and change and make this behavior happen more? Or should we just not care about that at all and work on making sure the user understands why they're there, and so that when they come to this point in this fork in the road, they will want to take the action that they're going to take, right?
Yeah. This is great. This is I would put a lot of what we are talking about as measuring and quantifying the software when it's in the wild and measuring the behaviors of people through the system, which I think is great. That's awesome. Calling back to something you mentioned earlier about the things you could control in the board meeting and talking about getting, going through your list there, you mentioned that I could make sure that they were all productive and doing things. And then buried in there, I think, is the statement that that one of the success metrics of an engineering team, or a team that's building these pods that build, is that each person on those teams is staying productive or staying busy doing. Is that it? One, am I unpacking your beliefs correctly, or correctly stating your statements?
Well, I want to hear two.
I think, and then two is is your belief that keeping each person on the software pod or software fully engaged, fully busy, the best way to optimize the system that produces software? Is that where you get a more optimal output of the software system or the creation of software?
I hope I was going to say absolutely not, right? Like, I think about process and productivity. It only really makes sense. And what matters at the end isn't whether all the people were busy and productive. It matters whether the system outputs the thing that you need the system to output. Thus, direction over velocity, right? And I've also learned the hard way that a team's maximal productivity in terms of output usually is nowhere near the same thing as every individual's maximum, like, what do you call it? Like maximum busyness? For certainly not, right? Like, I actually, at some point, had to, when a lot of rants about this, like, it doesn't matter if everybody's busy. optimally, I think you end up aiming for something like 70 to 80% utilization of any individual resource any given time. Again, going back to the knowns versus unknowns. If you don't have slack in the process, in people's workloads, then you can't handle unknowns. And that's the quickest way to actually blow a date, is to be over capacity when you find the thing that is going to happen, that is going to break your assumptions of what's going to happen, right? And it's pretty hard because in the day-to-day, if you're sitting on a team, and let's say that you're an engineer on a team, and you sit, there's a designer a couple of desks away from you, and you're in the middle of trying to get the release out, and the designer's yawning and like taking their third lunch break or whatever, or vice versa, right? But there's a reality that like it's not their job to be busy all of the time. And there are moments in various processes where one person may be extraordinarily busy and somebody else may not, right? And like I've always said that I'll work as much as I feel like it, which means I might be up in the middle of the night still working. I try to less these days, and I sort of think everybody else is like, work as much as you need to / want to, but I want you to work mostly sanely, right? Like. I go back to Jeff Wong taught me a lesson a long time ago, that we all used to work with, who I think the way he said it was that he's like when you go into a team, he'd been a consultant, he'd gone to a team that's off the rails, missing all the deadlines, that the first thing he would do, and this is like going way back in time, is like I would unplug the CI server at 5 p.m. every day. Basically, he's like, we're not going to let you work long hours anymore. And that's the only way we're going to get back to having any kind of a sane process and a sane schedule, right? And so there's this idea of like, yeah, okay, you need to make sure that people can't just slack off and do no work. But at the same time, if the team's output is what's most important, any individual person's daily productivity is kind of irrelevant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. I like that. So it came up a couple times so far, but you've talked about quality and delivering quality. And I think inside the engineering team or inside the system that is producing software, oftentimes that can be bundled up with technical debt. And I think every software project I've ever worked on, there becomes some point when there's large discussions about the technical debt and, a lot of emotion around that. So, first, have you seen good ways of discussing it, talking about it, reasoning about it, inventorying it? What are the patterns that you've seen that you've liked or that you think that there's real value in?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great topic. I think one thing I touched on earlier is that technical debt is very hard, maybe impossible to evaluate and understand from outside of engineering proper. Like you can want the technical debt to be less than the engineering team says it is, but you can't really tell them it's less than they say it is, right? So like however you're inventorying and understanding it, you kind of have to accept that. And I think that like when I was sort of product person, head of engineering, he would walk into the room for our quarterly or whatever it was planning session, and the first thing he would start with was what percentage of the team I actually had. Right? He'd be like, you think you have 20 engineers. You have 7. Now plan. And I was like, and his idea being like, he's like, I'm going to go up in advance, figure out what I need to do on a pure engineering level to be responsible and to work on managing our debt loads and doing infrastructure projects and whatever it has to be. And then what we should be talking about is what's left over. And by the way, of course, I would push back on that and be like, I'm gonna test you and see if that's really true, or if I can get you to give me one more engineer worth of bandwidth or whatever it is.
Can we, I really like this example. It's very concrete for me. What stage was that company in? Sounds like there was 20 people or 20 engineers. So there was revenue coming in. Was it profitable at that point, or was it still in a growth phase? Still on some uncertainty that was it going to reach escape velocity, or was it going to be able to raise the next round?
Yeah. And you bring up a really good topic there, right? I think I lost track of things I love to talk, but I lost track earlier when you're talking about like maybe it's goals, measurement, even process on a team by team level. I learned also to say that it really depends on what the team is doing how you optimize these things, right? And we started to talk about, as we got to a more mature organization and had 5 engineering teams running at the same time, right? We had to learn that there were parts of the organization that were working on the most mature pieces of code or the most mature product areas, and the standards for technical debt level that's acceptable for code quality would get increasingly high. And at the same time, we would have one team would go off and build a new prototype of some new product or new thing, and had to get very clear about saying that when you're working on this category over here, holding yourself to the same standard as the one that's like on the generates millions of dollars in revenue for us product is counterproductive, right? I actually think if you're prototyping, you better not be shipping things that are that high quality. They better be a little bit ugly. You better be throwing up some technical debt at that point, right? And I found it
What were the words you used? How did you communicate that idea, not just to the engineers who are working on it, but to the product people who are working on it, to the designers? How did that become a shared understanding of where on that curve you were and how to make those trade-offs, or what the right set point was as you transitioned from a proof of concept through that maturity curve?
First of all, it was to talk about it, like for a given project, or we would have teams that had sort of long-lived missions. For a given mission, at a given moment, where are we on the curve? And I'm a big crossing the chasm person, so I would often talk about, like, are we trying to hit like the innovator early adopter piece there? Then we should be moving as fast as we can to learn and get it right. Are we in the mass market part of the adoption curve, in which case we need to be very careful that we need to keep our quality standards super, super high, because those consumers will not tolerate a loss in quality, right? So crossing the chasm is my usual way of talking about that, but then just putting into our process that we would acknowledge that consciously at any given moment. And I think it's also to say, like, well, what's the team doing right now? If your job right now is to go and learn something and get some data points and prove a few things, then you are not. I think we talked about it as prototyping versus productizing, I think, right? There was like, if you're prototyping, experimenting, learning, you need to be aimed at how fast can I do that? And one of the lines we had to draw was, and the engineering team demanded that I draw this line for them, was like the explicit move from prototyping to productization. Because that's when the big shift would happen. And we would say, okay, when we decide to do that, right, I would turn to them and say, now we want to productize this. So, like, what does that mean? How do we get to the point where we can now start to hit the right level of quality standards and other metrics that we expect out of something that's going to be that level, right? So
the way that I've thought about that in the past is to say upfront to engineers, this is how many users I want this system to be able to take. And this is what the security or compliance regime is.
That seems like a good way to do it too.
If you do it that way, you say, hey, I know the thing's going to fall over if I have more than 10 simultaneous users. Like, okay, like stipulated. Can you build a version that works for 10 users or less?
Yeah. And the worst thing that happens is that when those things get pushed into production anyway, then you lose everyone's trust, right? So that's why that transition point is such an important conversation to have explicitly, right? And if the engineering team just like hates everyone if the thing that they thought they were building for 10 users is suddenly required to meet million user demand and be highly secure. Right? It's just a guaranteed failure. So one more point, technical debt. I want to come back because I had one more thought in this, which is that I'm sitting in downtown Manhattan right now, and I have the benefit of living in the middle of one of the world's big financial centers, right? And so the way that I have gotten to talk about technical debt, and I've heard talked about a fair amount here at least, is that debt isn't a bad word. Debt is a tool. And there are different kinds of debt. There are different interest rates. There are different consequences, right? So we got into talking a lot about like very simply.
In the financial world, it sounds like you're talking about interest rate, term, or maturity. Yep. And what are the payments like? Do you have to pay this monthly? Is this a weekly payment? Or is it a balloon payment at the end that you need to, we're going to need to overhaul the system? And then I think you're also bringing up something that I haven't heard talked about before, which is covenants on those debt. If you miss a payment, what is the severity? Do they come and they repo your whole house?
Yeah.
do all your servers crash? What happens?
Right. And this is related to the same maturity question, but also having a nuanced understanding of what kinds of debt you are creating. One of the things that we started to realize is there are whole categories of debt that never really come due and have low interest rates. It's like a 30-year fixed mortgage. And you're like, yeah, you know what? That's ugly. We're never opening that door again. It sits over there and does its thing. It's someone's terrifying Perl script. In 10 years, somebody else will fix it. We'll be a big profitable company at that point. Paying that debt down is actually a bad idea.
Having written that terrible Perl script, I don't think you're referring to the same one that I wrote.
Everybody has a terrible Perl script somewhere. That's a true statement about all software engineering.
I think for me it's much more bash, but fine. It's basically the same thing. How do you identify those? You said are you able to identify those pieces of debt ahead of time, or it's more retrospectively you're able to identify them, or only once you've started to build them you can identify them?
I think oftentimes in advance, you can identify some in advance, right? And one way I think about cheap debt versus expensive debt in advance is that there are choices you make. I mean, most, if not, technical debt can come from either bad decisions or just changes in the environment, right? Because at the end of the day, something no longer is what it needs to be. In terms of decisions, I've always felt that a good guideline is if you're making essentially some kind of a compromise on quality, and you are aware of it as you're making it, which there's a lot of ifs there, right? Like a lot of times you're not aware of it as you're making it, but if you're able to be aware of it, and that takes some maturity, then if you are making sort of a small code level compromise inside of a larger system that is actually still designed reasonably well. How do I say it? I used to say that that you can think about what the ideal end state of the system might look like someday. And over optimizing for that's usually a terrible idea, because by the time you get there, it won't look like that anymore. But if you're thinking that way and you at least have a knowledge of, okay, usually, and if I'm building X, then someday X is going to need to have error handling and blah, 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 right? I think it's easy to say a good technical debt is all right, comment, need error handling here, not doing it now, peace out, right? But the code structure is still there for it. And you're like, yeah, okay, I know I'm cutting corners, but it's going to be easy to clean up later. And then there's I'm just going to write a 700-line function to solve this problem instead of thinking about how to design it at all. Those tend to come back and bite you, because then that's you've kind of created this thing that now will define the structure. And so I always said if your code kind of looks like how you think it should be, and you're noting how explicitly you're not going to bother to do the parts that you know that you should, but you're not going to today, those are usually decisions that lead you to cheap, maintain, easy to pay down technical debt. And the other one though is the question of whether the technical debt's ever going to, so the probabilistic judgment of, is this technical debt ever going to come due? Which is why at the prototyping stage, it's lever up on credit cards as far as I'm concerned. I don't care, right? Because you're still at this stage where 50-50 chance we throw all of this away next month.
Or maybe higher, 80% chance we throw it away.
80% chance, whatever it is, right? Yeah, but maybe in some ways maybe the better. But if you look at that chance and you say, okay, if this is probably not going to work, then we shouldn't be worrying about anything except testing it. And then again, you have that moment where you go, aha, it worked. What are we doing? Stopping and productizing it, right? Not shipping it to the customer. And as that's in my experience, the hardest part of that is to be able to stop, because what usually happens in reality is oh, look, we're going to make this newfangled dashboard for the user. And we're going to test the idea by making a prototype one. And it's going to be one big giant pile of JavaScript and a nasty API call somewhere that has 400 lines of code to put it all together. And we put it out there and see how it works. And then the users go, oh my God, we love this. It's the best thing ever. And then of course, the CEO goes, I like this new dashboard. Turn it on. Everybody should have this. And you're like, no, you don't get it for 2 months, because that's you go back to the drawing board and say, like, okay, what does it take to deliver what we just delivered as a piece of junk, such that we can actually support it in production and feel happy about it.
So other than totally understand the trust from the engineering team, if you tell them that you're shipping a prototype and then you're going to have a chance, but let's assume that that there was no such deal, but you're forced to make a decision between, you have these two paths, and maybe it's never two paths, but let's say you artificially could only either ship that nasty 400 lines of JavaScript and turn it on for everybody, but you immediately get that product out and then you're having to remediate for however long, or you have to wait 2 months before your customers get that value. How do you reason about the economics of those two choices, of those two paths?
I mean, I'll tell you that at the very early stages of like a startup, for instance, ship it. If it works, ship it, like a lot of the times, because you probably have another 10 things to test the day after. And like you're still at the like, is the whole system going to work question, probably.
You're saying system level from like a technical system, or even like business model is the whole?
Yeah, the whole thing.
Care.
Right? Yeah. Does anybody care? Is anyone going to pay me money for it? Whatever that is, right? So like at that, when you're still existentially asking questions at that level, my bias has always been ship it, right? And if you were to ask some engineers who I've hired on later in the process what they think of that bias, they will have some choice words for you. And I think that you mentioned trust, and I think like more than anything else, that's a lot of what it comes down to, right? And if there's a good working relationship between engineering and product or whatever the business representatives are, then you can have those nuanced discussions of, are we going to ship this now and fix it later? Are we going to stop and do it right and ship that? Right? Are we going to put prototype into production, just cross our fingers and move on? At least you can have a rational discussion about that. I think a lot of the time, the trust level between those two parts of a company is not nearly good enough. And the tragedy of that is that it means that engineering is forced to act in a very conservative manner. And that's tragic because I look around, I think that's tremendous amounts of wasted energy. That means never using a credit card, right? Everything gets paid in cash, and like that's not the right way. That's not the optimal way to run a business or run anything, right? So I think that you can't overstate how important that trust relationship is, right? And I think it's also really tough to sustain any of the like, oh, we'll just pay that down later kind of stuff, because back to the like, you'll maybe finish priority 1 before priority 2 changes kind of thing. Like, there is no guarantee that when it comes around to like the next quarter or the next planning milestone or whatever it is, that the business has any appetite for the debt that you just accrued to pay that back, right? And it's easy to get stuck in that spot, and you're just piling it up, and then you get into these like, now we're stopping for 6 months to go fix stuff, or the effective bandwidth dropped to 20% of what it should be, or whatever, right? Those terrible things happen. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a solution to that other than like everybody needs to have an actually good, mature conversation about these things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So last question from me, then maybe we'll give Miles a chance to ask the last one for him. But what's a mistake you see people make in software that you would say that everybody makes, and that they could improve their software production or software writing abilities if they, as an organization, if they changed?
I think the mistake is going too fast. This is probably like more a statement about me than anybody else. And trying to muscle things across the finish line, right? And not having that discussion about the deadline, the reality, the changes in scope, and living in death march hell forever.
So fast in this definition would be trying to take the shortest time route, but not having a discussion about all the other pieces, all the other, either the risk you're absorbing from that, or the additional technical debt that you're accumulating from that, or the other.
Really fancy in Wall Street, you can start to analyze the risk in terms of the debt structure. But that's kind of what it comes down to, right? Like, I think most of the time, in reality, it's a systemic problem, but you get these pressures to deliver, and rather than have the really hard conversations about what's realistic and what we're trading off when we make those choices, we just try to deliver. And like try to keep to the deadline we said we were going to do, and everything goes to hell. Like
that's a great place to. That's a very optimistic note to end it on. I think I'm going to remember you at the whiteboard in this board meeting that I was not in, but I have a picture in my mind of you going through your 3 points of what I can control. I think that's
people, process, and transparency.
Yeah. I like it. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was super, super fun. Good to see everybody, and let me know when it's up.
Cool. Keep learning. This has been Quantified Software.